Hi, I'm Everett and welcome back to the shop. As part of the Tips Blitz 19 movement, I put together this quick little video of basically where I get some of my scrap metal. I realize that some of this information may be old hat to quite a few of you, but for some of you who may not have had a bit of an automotive background, it may be surprising to you how much can actually be reused off of a car in a home shop environment. And the material price may not be so bad, especially if you can make some connections with somebody in a local shop, be it a heavy-duty shop, automotive shop, or agricultural shop. It may just take all it might take is just taking a box of donuts and one of those carafes of coffee or whatever and have a schmooze at the shop foreman. They may even let you pick through the bin right there. And as time goes on, especially, I've done a few small jobs for even some of the local shops here. If they know that there's a local person who can make up small bits and pieces to fix tools and whatever, you may wind up with a bit more of a working relationship from that. So anyway, I'll just show you some of the examples of pieces that I've saved and people have saved for me for different projects and uses, and hopefully you find it interesting and useful. So this is a collection of pieces from scrap metal bins of shops where both I've worked and for shops where I've had friends work who've watched the bin for me. Various different things depending on the type of machinery that is being worked on. For example, this here is from a heavy-duty shop. It's actually, my buddy saved it for me before I started working there, but this is now from the heavy-duty shop I'm working at now part-time. This is an S-cam shaft off of the brakes for a like the drum brake system on a heavy truck or a highway transport trailer sort of thing, semi-trailer. It actuates the brakes. Well, actually, it releases the brakes. The springs actuate them, but they kind of get rusted in place, and then they wind up having to cut them off. And so this material here is it's hard enough to be nice and strong, decent material. However, it's also soft enough to cut on a metal lathe. So this stuff's pretty good. And I mean, it's what? Over 1.5 inches in diameter. So yeah, if you know anybody who works at a heavy truck shop, this would be a good, these would be good things to save. As well, speaking of heavy trucks, these are the bolts that are used, well, they were cut off with a torch. But these are the parts of the U-bolts. There is a part that went across here. These are what hold the springs to the axles in a heavy truck. And they're 800 thousandths or so across, or diameter, so you can easily cut them down and clean them up to a nice clean 3/4 of an inch. And again, these hit scrap metal bins. Same, sticking with the heavy truck shops, this here is a section of, this is the leftovers from what was cut off of what's called an air chamber or brake pot, which are the actuators that are used through some linkage to turn these guys to apply and release the brakes on an air brake system. These guys here are 5/8 18 fine thread, which is handy because this thread is also used in a lot of the cheaper and more commonly found presses, pullers, that sort of thing, toolbox type pullers, steering wheel pullers, that sort of thing. So I've used this sort of stuff to make up special tools for my toolbox for things like things like doing clutches in limited slip differentials to be able to spread the packs, that sort of thing. Really handy. It's basically free, fine, ready rod. Again, you'll find little chunks like this. This one's what, 8 inches long, just sitting in the scrap metal bin. What also has, well, we'll move over to automotive now. What also has a 5/8 18 are a lot of the spring U-bolts in pickup trucks. Anywhere that does a lot of lift kits, suspension work, you'll find these. Sometimes they'll come with 2 sets of U-bolts to a kit. And these things here, again, 5/8 18 threads, but it's a nice decent steel, nice long sections you can use. This stuff is hardenable. I was messing around with it in a video a while back. And it can actually harden, so it's got to have a decent amount of carbon in it. I'm not sure what kind of alloy it is. Most of this stuff is, mysterious, scraptonium, as rolling metal would call it. But it's, definitely still usable. Staying within automotive, or actually staying within automotive, we have CV axles. Steve Summers recently used one of these cut down to make a handle for his arbor press. Really good steel to work with. You can still cut it with carbide. You have to pop it apart. This is off a CV axle I changed for one of my friends in her Honda Odyssey. As well as axles, this is an intermediate shaft off of a Dodge Journey. What happens is the bearing comes with it from Mopar. Bearing was toast, so I pressed the bearing off and brought this home, and it's a nice piece of material. It's almost 2 inches across, about 1.75 inches or so. And yeah, it's a good steel. You can still cut it with carbide, make a shaft out of it for something. Speaking of axles and shafts, this is a piece of axle shaft out of a Dodge half-ton. They normally kind of look like this, with the splines and stuff on the end. These, however, you have to cut with an abrasive cutoff wheel. They're hard enough for that, but you can cut them with carbide. So I have actually made a few things out of this type of material. The big thing is it's harder on the surface than it is in the center. Must be some sort of induction hardening or something, I'm not sure. But yeah, you can actually cut this with carbide and reuse these shafts in all sorts of small scale stuff. And again, you do it right, you get it free. These here, back to the heavy trucks. These are cut off center sections of torque rods, which are used to help locate the rear axle in a heavy truck because they're suspended by air and springs and such. These are cut off on the end. They normally have a round end with a hole through it with a bushing. Again, my buddy from the heavy truck shop saved those for me. The other day, one other thing is I used a tie rod end here. This is an automotive tie rod end. Made an arbor for a hole saw for something I was working on the other day. And yeah, free material. Just took a little bit of time. This actually it's a little gummier, a little softer, but it's quite a nice material to work with otherwise. It reminds me more of a mild steel, but it's probably got some more strength to it. If we go to, within automotive as well, to steering. Anything with a solid front axle and the long drag link, like this is the drag link that goes from the, there's the pitman arm end, and that end goes to the right knuckle. These things here are, when you have a looseness in one of these joints, the whole shaft has to go. Well, this is great material to work with. So, I just have a couple small bits here I've been working with, making different things out of. So yeah, Dodge pickups, Jeeps, I think Ford pickups have a long solid rod between as well. Anything with a solid front axle, excellent material to work with. This can be hardened as well. Again, I was messing around in one of my earlier videos with substandard equipment, trying to test hardness and such. And it's actually really good material to work with. If you have anybody who works at an off-road shop, like we're doing lift kits and stuff, these here are shims that go between the steady bearing and the frame in order to adjust for driveline angles to try to minimize vibration. These things here come in a variety of thicknesses. You wind up getting a whole stack like about this much or a little bit more per kit, and they often don't use very many of them. So a lot of these, into the scrap bin. This is awesome metal to work with. It's basically the equivalent of hot rolled as far as dimensional accuracy, but it's got a nice finish on it, whatever. But again, this is great stuff to work with. One of the more unconventional things, I pulled this out of a dumpster, one of the local apartment buildings. This is the brace that you put on the back of wooden shelving from like that big yellow and blue box, cheap equipment or cheap furniture store. These things here are, I think they were 6 millimeters in diameter. And this came in really handy because I used these, for example, as the axles in the shuttles from my mom's weaving. My mom's into the local fiber arts guild in her town, and then we made some shuttles for her for doing rugs and such. And so these worked out great for that. So if you watch a dumpster, you can get that. As far as going into agricultural stuff, I have a friend who used to work at an ag repair shop, combines, tractors, that sort of thing. You want to be getting a shaft like this come through, and I can, it's got a bit of run out to it. It's kind of bowed, but for a short section that doesn't matter for me, a little bit scored in the ends, whatever. So this is scrap to them, and it was in the bin. So my buddy saved it for me. He also, this is excellent material to work with. My same buddy was also watching for me and grabbed this for me as it was headed to the bin. It's a top shaft out of a combine harvester, and it's 6 foot long. The hex portion is a 2.5-inch hex, and this is all going to be melted down again. So he saved it for me. I can only imagine how much this piece would cost. So, I mean, that was kind of nice of him to save it for me. One other fun source of cheap metal is bed frames. This stuff actually is, fairly easy to work with, apart from, I found with welding, the only downside is with welding, the stuff must have some carbon in it simply because you have a little bit of issue with cracking if you're not careful. I made some cool stuff out of this. Again, I'm not making anything that's going to be structurally critical or going down the highway like a trailer. I'm not going to use it for anything like that, but for something, around the shop or whatever, it's actually not that bad to play with. In fact, I made a stand for my surface plate out of this stuff, and it came out quite nicely. I quite like how it turned out. So I've now pulled 6 or 7 of these out of dumpsters in the last year, and local apartment buildings, that sort of thing, they're just getting rid of them. And yeah, it's free metal. You just have to work within its limits. And yes, it is quite strong material. My suspicion is, I've heard rumors that this stuff is re-rolled railroad track, which has a reasonable amount of steel in it, or carbon in it as well. So decent material to weld or work with. Just if you're welding it, you got to be careful. One other piece of material that I got from a scrap bin that I'm going to save and use. This is a cut-off piece of basically a bucket edge, or grater blade edge, or whatever you want to use it for. It's just about 1 foot long, just a hair under 1 foot. Now, I have 1055 written on it because from what I've read, as far as research and whatever, that a lot of grater blades are made of 1055 with a bit of hardness to them. And so I'm saving this guy here, and at some point, I'd like to use it on the press and make a press brake out of it. Again, it's on the to-do list, it just hasn't gotten to it yet. But I mean, again, I actually cut it off I used a longer piece to replace the bit on edge on a Bobcat, and so this is the leftover bit that I saved. So if you know anybody who has any of this kicking around, this could be very useful as well. Now, as far as aluminum and casting, I don't have foundry facilities yet, but I have been collecting. The big thing is you're trying to find a decent alloy that's going to cast. Well, one of the best ways I would suspect is start by car parts that have been cast. Like this brace that came off of a 3.8 liter Buick V6. This is a Honda water pump. This is a water neck and thermostat from an Infinity. I mean, 3 different companies, but considering the fact that all 3 have been cast, I would suspect that this would be an alloy that would, or if you melted these 3 together, you should still come up with something that would make a reasonable casting. Again, I haven't gotten into casting yet, but when I do, I'll be trying to keep different mixes of aluminum separate. One source that I would like to use as time goes on, depending on where I can find more, are front steering knuckles from some of the modern vehicles. A number of them are aluminum, kind of like the Dodge pickups, like this one here, and this one here from the new Ram 1500s. Newer Ram 1500s have aluminum knuckles, so it's probably forged, but it should still cast okay. Again, I have to experiment, but there are all sorts of different parts to a car that could be reused. Double Boost mentioned one time, John Mills there, that he'd mentioned that he uses BMW suspension arms in his castings because it's a decent alloy. So if it works for him, I'm sure it'll work for us. Again, most of this is Mysterium metal, so you'll have to take that into account in your design, but for the most part, most of the stuff is pretty good alloy of some type. So I hope that's helpful for you. So I realize that some of this may be old news to a lot of you, but hopefully it can be of use to some of you who may not have thought about using using certain car parts in certain applications in your projects. But otherwise, again, hopefully the TIPS Blitz 2019 movement has a little bit of an effect. Hopefully it gets us all a bit more exposure and introduces a number more people to our community and what we can do. So otherwise, thanks everybody for watching. Thanks for subscribing, all of those of you who subscribe. If you're just passing through, again, welcome. Thanks for coming by. Likes, comments, whatever, that's all appreciated. Otherwise, thanks for everything. Thanks for all your support, everybody, and I'll see you next time.